Hi, I'm Dr. Lucy Blue from the University of Southampton, and I'm a coordinator of the Maritime Endangered Archaeology Project, otherwise known as MarEA. MarEA, which started in 2019, essentially adopts the principles of the EAMENA Endangered Archaeology in the Middle East and North Africa project that you're all very familiar with. It respects the methodological approach of documentation and data storage, but the significant difference for MarEA is that it focuses on the dynamic coastal and nearshore underwater zone. It was recognised quite earlier on that there was a requirement for an expertise in maritime archaeology to complement the terrestrial focus of the EAMENA team. It was also recognised, regressively, that the maritime zone in the MENA region, and one could say beyond as well, is under huge threat from both natural and human impacts. So essentially, the MarEA project is about documenting the coastal zone in a comprehensive manner, noting all coastal, nearshore, and underwater sites visible from satellite imagery, of course, this being the primary source of data that the EAMENA project uses, through to recorded extant documentation, archives, etc. This is the team. MarEA is made up of the Universities of Southampton and the Universities of Ulster, headed up by myself and my colleague Dr. Colin Breen. This is our great team, and they're all professional researchers with focuses on the regional archaeology. We obviously work very closely with EAMENA, the Universities of Oxford, Leicester and Durham, that you're now very familiar with. But like EAMENA, we also liaise with governmental bodies in the region, those responsible for the archaeology, as well as NGOs and academics that have a focus in the regional archaeological remit. So what is significant about maritime or coastal environments? Why do we bother looking at them? Well, effectively, currently, nearly half of the global population lives within an hour of the coast. In fact, in the MENA region, it's more than half of the population. And the principle is that whilst we can see that there's a huge dependence upon the sea in the modern context, both in terms of trade, but also in terms of livelihood and resources, we recognise that in the past, human society had a similar dependence and reliance on the sea. The sea provided not only a means of transportation, mobility and connectivity across the coasts, along the sea, access to the hinterlands, etc., but also and importantly, it provided those marine resources such as shellfish and fish, obviously the coastal flora and fauna. But living in this coastal zone gave access to both terrestrial and aquatic resources. So it was the best of both worlds in effect. And from those, the context of people living in these regions grew maritime traditions, grew the need to build boats to cross these bodies of water, build the need to understand navigating by the stars. So the technology and infrastructure began to reflect this coastal habitation. But one thing we need to recognise is that the sea level today is not the same as it was in the past. In fact, over the 500,000 years that we've been looking at sea level change, it has changed quite dramatically, as this diagram shows. Global sea level change is clearly a product of climate change. And if you look at the grey area on this slide, you'll see the climatic fluctuations over that 500,000 year period. And they very much mirror the global sea level patterns. So when the climate increases, the weather is warmer, the ice caps melt and the sea level rises. And the opposite happens when colder epochs hit. The period of time that archaeologists are mostly interested in is this later Holocene period, the last 25,000 years. And you can see at the peak of the last ice age, around 25,000 years, sea levels were considerably lower, in fact, in some places up to 120 metres lower. And as they gradually rose, as the temperatures increased, then coastal landscapes became inundated by the sea, which meant the landscapes were changing. People who lived in those coastal zones were obviously having to adapt to these rising sea levels. I'll give you an example. So the red bit here indicates the areas that are now underwater as a result of sea level rise. So in 26,000 BC, these areas would have been land or ice, as you can see. The picture changes some 12,000 years ago, and now all of these red areas are underwater. So we have to think about how people reacted to these rising sea levels. And as a result, one of the key themes that maritime archaeologists look at, just to give you a slight insight into what we study as maritime archaeologists, is how past landscapes, human habitations, coastal settlements, etc., have been affected by these changing landscapes, by the changing sea level, along with tectonic change, etc. I'll explain a little bit more about that later. But so one of the things we're looking at is these past paleo environments, as we call them, submerged settlements, trying to work out through the signatures of sea level rise, the patterns of Holocene sea level rise, tectonic activity, land movement, where the land would have been relative to the sea in the past, and therefore where we might look for now submerged beneath the seas ancient settlements. Connecting to that is also our theme around coastal archaeology. So, in the past and in the present, people live in this coastal zone, as I explained earlier. So, we have signatures of that, the built environment, ports and harbours, landing places, fishing installations, looking at the way that resources were used in the past, coastal industries. Here are a couple of examples. Here are sites that have either been submerged. The left-hand site shows you a Neolithic settlement submerged under a couple of metres water, or sites that have been affected by rising sea levels, eroded effectively by the sea, but also now partially submerged by the sea. And this is one of the challenges, obviously, that the MarEA project looks at. Coastal installations, this is the Crusader Harbour at Sidon, and this is a quite unique feature along the Alexandrian coast. But we also look at the traditional thing that people think of when they think of maritime archaeologists, at shipwrecks. And there's a vast range of different types and preservation of shipwrecks in the MENA region, both relating to cargo vessels, but also to ships of war. And the signatures for these vessels can be quite different depending on the environments in which they sank and their preservation. In some cases, the top left, this is outside of the MENA region, but in the Black Sea, where the preservation is extremely good. Or they simply have the remnants of the cargoes that they carried. These are amphora from the Mediterranean region. And these are colleagues of ours actually in Egypt recording some of the remnants of cargoes in the Red Sea. And finally, we also look at the slightly less tangible elements of maritime culture, the practices, the materials that are left behind. There are stone anchors in the middle, but also the modern signature, the traditional boat building techniques. And perhaps also the bottom left shows you some of and the bottom right as well, shows you buildings where people store fishing gear, the nets they're using. So we're looking at a range of materials, not just the ceramics that carried the cargoes or the wooden barrels that carried the wine, but we're also looking at the practices and beliefs that are also connected with maritime activities, people's interactions with the sea. So I hope that gives you a brief overview of the type of material that we're looking at as maritime archaeologists and the sorts of things we're documenting through the MarEA project. And the reason we're doing this, like EMENA, is because the coastal zone in particular is under threat. It's under threat from natural processes, that continuation of climate change, impact of coastal sea level rises. You can see bottom right here predictions of inundation of the Nile Delta over the coming decades. But these are obviously accelerating at the moment because of climate change, coastal erosion, etc. But also the impact of human activity. One of the first slides I showed you indicated how many people live in the coastal zone. And in order to do that, they need infrastructure to support them, houses, urban development. In accompanying that, there are also things like marine industries, fishing, the pollution those sort of things generate. So our coastlines are under threat, and this is why we need to document them and document change, in many cases quite rapid change, as quickly as possible. So if we can't mitigate that damage, at least we have a record of the past archaeological signatures. So with that in mind, the overall aims and objectives of MarEA are as follows: to comprehensively and rapidly document maritime archaeological heritage in coastal and nearshore zones of the Middle East and North Africa, to assess the condition of archaeological sites and the potential threats in a similar way that EAMENA does, to develop an improved understanding of the nature and extent of maritime cultural heritage in the region, and to integrate all of this data into the EAMENA Open Access Online database. This can then be used for people like you, for the people who are responsible for the archaeological resource, both on land, on the coastline, and underwater. And we work very closely where we're able with the government agencies who are responsible for cultural heritage management. So, how does MarEA differ from EAMENA? Well, obviously, we've identified this coastal focus. We work in a similar way to EAMENA by following the grid squares that EAMENA uses, but obviously the coastal grid squares. And our area is equivalent to something in the region of 1.5 million square kilometres. Obviously, a huge area to cover. You can see it outlined in that image in the top right. And we operate roughly within the coastal plain up to 20 kilometres inland, depending on how the grids fall, as you can see at the bottom. Sometimes they encompass very little land, other times they're almost entirely underwater. It's true to say that detecting archaeological material underwater, particularly through satellite imagery, can be quite challenging. But obviously the priority areas are determined in a similar way to EAMENA. We're looking for the areas of greatest threat and the areas of greatest potential. And like EAMENA, the work you've been doing and the training you've been having, we're primarily reliant upon satellite imagery, but obviously accessing academic literature, extant published literature, archives, government archives, etc. So the methodology, as you can see, is the same as EAMENA. We have been working on this project now for just over a year, and these are the areas that we've been focusing on and the rough area coverage. We work to an area coverage goal effectively, so I think we're doing pretty well so far. So what are we looking for exactly? What signatures in the archaeological record, or what is the archaeological assessment, and how does that differ from the archaeological assessment of terrestrial sites? Well, effectively it doesn't. The only difference is that obviously there are different types of sites that we may be looking for in the coastal zone and underwater. This shows you a site of Tabat al-Hammam in Syria, where it identifies some of those coastal features, ancient breakwaters, for example, quays, coastal quarrying, but then things that equate to terrestrial finds such as the Tell or Mound site. So we're integrating similar types of sites, but adding to that archaeological assessment. Obviously trying to identify the site and the specific feature, but also thinking about the dating in the same way that EAMENA does, and some degree of interpretation. We also think about the condition assessment. This is a critical part of the EAMENA process. How under threat are these sites? What is the nature of the disturbance and what is causing these disturbances? And so we've developed a different type of thesaurus that identifies activities that are unique to the maritime zone, obviously building on the EAMENA terms, so things like dredging or trawling, salvage operations, etc. And here you can see the harbour of Jable, also in Syria, and we're monitoring how, with the use of satellite imagery, this landscape has changed and been adapted over time with the extension of breakwaters out into the sea, building on ancient natural anchorages. We're also thinking about the environmental context for coastal sites. As I have demonstrated, the coastline regardless of the threat to it in our modern day context, has always been under dynamic change because of the very nature of erosion and coastal progradation. This means sediment building up at river mouths, and obviously the changes relating to sea level rise. So we have to make an assessment of things such as the coastal topography, the geology, how solid is the bedrock, how prone to erosion is the surface and bedrock geology, what depositional processes are these coastlines subject to. We also have to think about the marine environment. How are things like waves and winds, tidal energy, how are they impacting on the coastline, and how are they changing the coastline from how we see it today and in terms of how it may have been in the past. So the environmental assessment, the environmental context is very important. But as I've also indicated, there is this element of change. And in fact, MarEA has developed a specific paleo landscape or geoarchaeological resource model that tries to work out through a variety of resources change over time. I've spoken quite a lot about change due to sea level rise as a product of Holocene sea level rise or changing climate and impacts of changing sea levels. But we also need to think about, as I've hinted at, how coastal processes impact on accretion, which is sediment buildup, or erosion of the coastline. And this can be further hampered by building constructions from the land into the sea, which change the way that the sediments move along the coast. So we're thinking about what we call paleo coastlines, ancient coastlines, whether they're visible today underwater or buried under sediment. And these would have obviously have impacted how people use these coastal landscapes in the past and how we monitor and detect them today. And we can identify some of these things through bathymetry. So if we're able to map the seabed using geoacoustic equipment, specialised marine geophysical survey equipment that you can see in Ras Ibn Hani here, you can identify paleo channels, ancient harbours that have now been inundated, or potentially if they're on land buried. You can also think about where ancient coastlines were, whether they're now underwater or maybe some metres up inland even. Here is a paleo coastline from Jabil in Lebanon, where you can see the beach deposits, but as a result of, I presume in this case, tectonic uplift, are now some metres above sea level. So there are many different signatures that give us an insight into how and where the coastlines and shorelines of the MENA region would have been in the past. And obviously this is important to note so that we can work out where people would have lived in relation to those sea levels and how we identify and interpret these ancient sites. Finally, the MarEA project as EMENA works very closely with local partners. We are developing a number of in-field projects. The bottom left one shows a colleague of ours in Egypt, where we're developing some coastal and underwater survey along the northwest Mediterranean coast, which is increasingly under threat. We have been involved with the EMENA training programs in Lebanon and in Jordan so far. And from the Jordan training program, we were able to develop quite an understanding of the port of Aqaba. I would definitely recommend you looking at our story map link on our website. So clearly we're interested in working with local partners and helping them develop their maritime resource. In some countries this is very limited, in others it's very advanced, but also to think about how to manage these important coastal, nearshore and underwater signatures of past human activity with the sea. So I hope I've made it clear that MarEA, Maritime Endangered Archaeology, or Endangered Archaeology in the Middle East and North Africa, is very much working in liaison with EMENA. All the data we collate is following the same principles and outline of the database that EMENA use. We're essentially uploading data into the EMENA database. We have, as I've indicated, developed this separate geoarchaeological model to recognise the distinction of the paleo landscapes and environmental context of the maritime zone. But otherwise, everything that we're doing falls exactly within the EAMENA methodological documentation and database and will be pumped out on the open access data. Our project runs through to 2024, and as I've said, we have teams in Ulster and Southampton, but working closely with partners in the region. So if you're interested in finding out more, I would suggest you check out our website. Please feel free to contact us. We'd love to talk to you more about the challenges you face in the context of your marine maritime resource. There are also some very useful publications and YouTube videos that you could look at if you want to find out more. Some of them in Arabic, so the two links at the top are in Arabic. There's a whole maritime archaeology and underwater cultural heritage book that has been written by my colleague in Alexandria that is in Arabic. I would definitely recommend looking at the Honor Frost website where you can see some of the maritime funded projects, and then of course UNESCO and our maritime archaeological timeline. So please, if you have any more questions, we'd love to listen, we'd love to talk, we'd love to develop closer relationships with antiquities departments in the MENA region. Many thanks for listening.